Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, Rhodesian here. 1 month later, and I am still waiting for my PAL, which is currently sitting on an RCMP desk in New Brunswick at the time of publishing this video. So I thought I might kill the wait with doing some research into firearms, specifically the history of them in Canada. While we hear that those who think that the government wants to disarm the public and confiscate all firearms are just simply conspiracy theorist loons, and that we have nothing to fear and we only need a few common sense firearm laws to keep everyone safe, the following information might be a bit of a system shock. So let's start off with a brief overview of the laws. Up until the 1960s, Canada had very few restrictions on firearms. For much of the country's history, Canada was a frontier country, which meant that one had to hunt, defend the homestead against wildlife, and the populace lived far away from cities with organized constabularies. Acquisition of firearms was a relatively simple and straightforward process. Many Canadians had at least one in their household. In fact, even in 1996, 1 in 5 Canadian households had one or more firearms. Only recently that the idea of the right to bear arms has been seen by the general public as a taboo, a phrase only repeated by uneducated, alcoholic, rural folk living in shacks. The notion of this right to bear arms comes straight from our Anglo traditions. In the English 1689 Bill of Rights, the right of every Englishman to bear arms for defense was seen as a fundamental God-given right, and was thoroughly defended by Sir William Blackstone here in his 1765 Commentaries on the Laws of England. For the Anglo world, firearms were a tool. They provided food, they defended oneself against threats by animals and criminals, and most importantly, it was the tool to preserve one's liberty. The American Revolution could not have been won without the firearms pointing in the direction of the tyrannical redcoats. The War of 1812 was won by Anglo and French Canadian settlers driving off American invasions. Firearms protect one from threats foreign and domestic. However, governments came quickly to realize this, and it wasn't long before they got the idea that introducing laws on when one could possess a firearm, where one could possess a firearm, what kinds of firearms one was permitted to possess, meant that the populace could be peacefully and slowly disarmed with the lie that the country would be safer overall, since criminals would have a harder time acquiring such dangerous weapons. All major pushes in gun control in Canada have come on the heels of an armed resistance by the public against threats from the government. I'd like to draw our attention to a few years of particular interest, and the new laws that came shortly thereafter following the resolution of these crises. Number 1, 1837 and 1838. Number 2, 1885. Number 3, 1990. In each of those years, an armed rebellion occurred against the state and resulted in varying degrees of violent confrontation between the people and the state. For the Canuck audience, they should be able to recall back to high school history classes in which this material was covered, but never the fallout and aftermath of those rebellions. Only how everyone came together, and the government needed to be slightly more inclusive in the future to prevent one's identity group's feelings from being hurt. I'm going to go over briefly the rebellions and the gun control that followed them, and why it was introduced. I won't be making moral judgments here on who had legitimate grievances or not. If you're interested, feel free to read more on each of these subjects. First, the Upper and Lower Canada rebellions of 1837 to 1838. Prior to the rebellion, tensions had been rising in British North America due to a number of reasons. The French were chafing under British rule, Englishmen in Upper Canada looked across the border, and some of them liked what they saw. And to make a complicated story short, 2 rebellions occurred in late 1837 and early 1838, both of which were brutally put down by the Crown using local militias who raped and burnt villages on the way to restoring control. And this also almost started a war with America when the Royal Navy ordered militias to capture and destroy the Caroline, an American ship supplying some of the rebels, causing the death of at least 1 American citizen. However, the aftermath of the 1837-1838 rebellions was gun control. Legislation was quickly passed outlawing, and I quote, unlawful training of persons to the use of firearms, unquote. This ensured that one could no longer train others to use firearms, and that if one wanted to learn, they would have to learn from a person in the employ of the state. Thus, the government would know who is learning how to use firearms and be able to keep track of who knows and who doesn't know. This also serves to bottleneck the process by restricting individuals from becoming firearms instructors. Only the government-approved instructors could be genuine instructors. The next major step taken by the Canadian government in gun control does not come until 1885. This was the year of the Second Riel Rebellion, also called the North-West Rebellion. Louis Riel, a French-speaking man of part French, part native Indian heritage, resisted encroachment by English-speaking Protestant settlers moving out to what would become the province of Manitoba. Resistance took the form of passionate speeches, interrupting land surveyors, forming their own provisional government, and even occupying a local fort, before resulting in Riel executing a man sentenced by the provisional government for interference with the provisional government and insubordination. Riel fled to America before being arrested by the Canadian militia led by the British military. However, this was not the end of him, as he returned in 1885 as a response to the Métis. They are a half-European, half-native group who are now settled in what would become the province of Saskatchewan, and who was still unhappy with the Canadian government, an influx of English-speaking settlers, and declining bison populations. Riel organized a number of Métis and Native Indians into an uprising, which the Crown responded with by sending Canadian militiamen, British soldiers, cavalry, and artillery. The very short-lived rebellion gave concern to the state once more about the ability of the people to resist the government due to perceived grievances. Legislation was passed on the 20th of July, 1885. This is the same day as Louis Riel stands trial for high treason. This new law prevented natives, Métis, and, quote, disloyal, unquote, settlers from possessing rifled firearms and cartridge ammunition, but it did allow them to continue possessing smoothbore muzzleloaders and shot. There's a significant difference in the range and accuracy between rifle barrels and smoothbore because the aerodynamics on the projectiles. Spinning projectiles are more stable and thus more accurate over longer ranges. But when the enemy possesses more advanced technology than yourself, one is inclined not to resist them, but just to let them do what they want to do. By limiting the weaponry of potential dissidents who saw Riel as a martyr against a tyrannical British colony, the Canadian government ensured that any rebels would not have an access to an equal level of weaponry, and instead be defending themselves with inferior firearms. Between 1885 and 1990, few major gun control laws were passed that targeted Canadians on a whole, with the goal of removing or restricting access to firearms. However, many laws were passed during this time period targeting non-European firearm owners, either through registries or restricting access. This culminated in a long gun registry in the 1940s that identifies the name, address, race, and whether or not the person is a British subject. I won't go into depth on this, as I want to focus in this video exclusively on the correlation between resistance to the state and state reaction in terms of disarmament. 1990 marked the last of the three of these, with the Oka crisis between local Mohawk Indians and Indian sympathizers from across Canada and America against the Canadian government. Around the 18th century, Iroquois tribes migrated from their homelands south of the Great Lakes to the St. Lawrence, driving out the Huron Indians. A tract of land claimed by the Mohawk tribe, upon which was said to be a historical burial ground, was set to be developed as an expansion to the nearby golf course. 3 years earlier, the Mohawk lost a land claim against the town and golf course over this very land in question. The local Mohawk tribes took to barricading access to the land to prevent development, to which the government of Quebec responded by deploying tactical police to force the protesting Indians out and dismantle their barricade. What ensued was a 15-minute firefight between the police and Mohawk, ending with the police falling back, 6 vehicles and a bulldozer seized by the Mohawk Indians, and 1 dead policeman shot by the Mohawk. Several highways and roadways were blocked, both by the Indians and the Quebec government, to surround the rebels. Eventually, negotiations prevented more bloodshed, and the Indians gave up their occupation of the disputed land and their rifles. Bill C-71 was introduced in 1991 following the resolution of the Oka crisis. This law, so far, and let's hope it doesn't get any worse, was the closest Canada came to a gun ban. In fact, it banned a number of guns, namely the ones used at Oka, such as the AK-47 and derivatives of it, and the FNFAL. The SKS narrowly avoided the ban, and AR-15 style rifles were quasi-banned. This is why Canada has nonsensical firearm laws on what is non-restricted versus prohibited. For the non-Canuck listeners, we have 3 classifications of firearms here. These classifications were introduced in the very law: non-restricted, restricted, and prohibited. For simplicity's sake, I will briefly state that non-restricteds are your rifles and shotguns, restricteds are your handguns and rifles under 18.5 inches, and prohibiteds are your handguns under 105 millimeters or in 22 or 32, and rifles less than 18 inches, automatics, and anything else they feel like banning for the hell of it. There is a link in the description below for more information on this. But it's led to some silly and contradictory laws that were written up and enforced by those who have zero knowledge about firearms. This is non-restricted, as well as this. Yet the AK-47 is banned. And the Canadian government considers that gun the exact same as this guy here. Our greatest ally is non-restricted, yet the Baguette Blaster is banned. And my personal favorite is that this is non-restricted, this is restricted, and this is prohibited. Canada is just a case study. Gun control laws are here to disarm the population and ensure that the people cannot resist the government, and that gun control laws only target law-abiding people while being as useless as tits on a bowl for criminals. Even Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister, recognized that gun control does not work and that it only succeeds in, and I quote, disarming the person who ought to be armed and arming the rowdies, unquote. It really rings true about that old adage, with a minor edit, if I may. First, Ottawa came for the Republicans, and I did not speak out because I was not a Republican. Then Ottawa came for the French-speaking Indians, and I did not speak out because I was not a French-speaking Indian. Then Ottawa came for landowning Indians, and I did not speak out because I was not a landowning Indian. Ask yourself, Canadians, at what point does Ottawa come for you, and there is no one left to speak out for you?
'Cause we're all Rhodesians and we'll fight through thick and thin. We'll keep our land the freelands of the enemy coming in. We'll keep them north of us and easy till that river's running dry. And this mighty land will